All right, welcome back from lunch. We're ready to have our next speaker. Alayo Tripp is a presidential postdoctoral fellow in speech language hearing sciences department here at the University of Minnesota. They will be talking about their work modeling linguistic diversity and addressing what is noise and what is or isn't variation. Alayo uses they, them pronouns, and welcome to the stage.
Thanks so much. I'm really glad to be here. So I really appreciated the other talks I've seen today, and I'm going to be reiterating some of the same points. But so in a lot of ways, reproducibility has come to be synonymous with responsible, sound, accessible science. And I absolutely concur that we should strive to produce accessible, responsible, ethical research. But that's exactly why I want to talk about some of the pitfalls we get when we place an overemphasis on reproducibility. So let's start by roughly defining what reproducibility is and why it's important. So what does reproducibility tell us? That happened. If we're able to reproduce the results of an experiment, we can be pretty sure the results actually are what they were originally reported to be. And if we can't reproduce the results of an experiment, then that could affect our confidence in the accuracy of the original report. So since we all agree that accuracy is important in any scientific endeavor, we all have an investment in trying to make sure our work meets standards of reproducibility. But to put this in perspective, we also need to consider what reproducibility doesn't tell us and how we should think about the value of replication in that context. So, although there's undeniable value in being able to successfully reproduce key findings, improving our scientific understanding means we need to do a lot more. So reproducing a result doesn't actually help us understand how we should think about that result. How we should think about its significance, its causes, its impacts. So let's put this conversation in a historical context. What's happened is that our institutions of higher education have historically advanced scientific agendas which are exclusionary and harmful. So my perspective is as a language scientist. So I'll focus on the consequences of these biases, specifically for psycholinguistics, speech language hearing sciences. But obviously, this problem extends beyond all disciplinary borders. So as we look to the future, I feel I have to raise the question, reproducibility for what? If we actually recognize that the value placed on reproducibility has historically actually functioned to erect barriers and has been pitted against equity and inclusion, that reproducibility, the rhetoric surrounding it, is often used to erect additional barriers to credibility and to essentially instruct those who already have institutional power on how to consolidate it. So if we think of promoting reproducibility as promoting the preservation of our fields as they currently exist, then the endeavor is transparently, fundamentally oppressive. So reproducible science is no good if it's irresponsible, if it's unethical, and if it's harmful. And we have to be aware that promoting reproducibility has functioned as a tool to promote the status quo. So when we talk about reproducibility, we really need to keep the bigger picture in mind, our ethics and our social justice goals. So in this talk, I want to first identify how this tradition of centering asocial models, I very much loved the term physics envy, it sets up a premise where failing to account for the influence of social positioning and social orientation in study outcomes is completely normalized. In a paradigm where we're relying on theories that don't make contact with social effects, theories that don't make contact with processes of racialization, processes of gendering, or the application of other social category schema, in that situation, if we fail to reproduce a finding, we aren't called to consider that these social phenomena might have something to do with that. Instead, we're encouraged to avoid the issue altogether by only pursuing representative samples. So practices which maximize replicability don't maximize our learning. In fact, I want to convince you that they actually can trick us into thinking that we know more than we actually do. Okay, so accounting for effects of social knowledge is really hard because social knowledge is always changing, it's variable between groups, and that kind of variability isn't readily captured in convenient samples. But I'm going to try to convince you that even though it's hard, this is the work we really need to be doing in social sciences and beyond. So these problems aren't new problems. The reason these problems haven't been solved isn't because we didn't know they existed. They've remained unsolved because the academy has historically defined these problems and the scholars who care about them as irrelevant. So I'm going to talk to you about some work that I recently published with my postdoctoral mentor, Ben Munson. And the data and methods of this study are fully available online. So what we did is we took a popular set of speech materials, often used to test intelligibility, and we surveyed adults online to find out if they thought the sentences sounded natural and whether they thought they could guess social information about the person who wrote the sentence based off of reading it. And so what we ended up finding was that a resource which has been heavily used to do speech intelligibility studies for the last century actually isn't socially neutral at all. So first, I want to describe what we know about language variation and how our knowledge of language variation has been incorporated traditionally into models of speech perception and acquisition. So there's a lot of linguistic variation that we could describe, like a lot of linguistic variation. So obviously, we can't actually tackle all of this at once. Creating a theoretical model means simplifying things. So what do we prioritize? Well, traditionally, formal linguistics has centered these three constructs in describing linguistic phenomena. We talk about differences in physiology. So for example, tall people sound different than short people. Differences in structure, the linguistic knowledge that people have, and differences in disruptive factors. So despite the fact that we've traditionally focused in on this very asocial perspective, we have loads and loads of evidence that social information affects our speech processing. And I want to emphasize to you that when I say social factors affect your speech processing, I mean that hearing the exact same speech in two different contexts can actually make you believe that you've heard two completely different things. So we have lots of findings showing that drawing participants' attention to social characteristics can actually change their experience of speech, like right down to literally which words did you hear. So there's two examples up on this slide, and I want to stress that these findings, you can find these kinds of results both by actually visually presenting information to the listener in the experiment, but you can also get these results just by asking the participant to imagine the social group membership of the person they're listening to. Just asking them to imagine that the voice they're hearing belongs to a particular kind of person can change what they hear. So we also know that all of these sorts of social effects that we describe, perception of accents and intelligibility, that all of this changes depending on factors affecting the individuals. So what their experience is with different languages, how good their hearing is. So if we know that social expectations impact speech, and we know that everyone doesn't have the same social expectations, how do we even begin to unravel all of this? So let's look at the limitations of the asocial approach, which has gotten us a lot of traction in understanding linguistic structure, but can only take us so far. So a model that relies principally on physiology and structure to define language differences necessarily defines all variation we find between groups as arising from physiological differences and difference in language knowledge. All right, so this is already pretty dicey. But once we add this perspective that the rest of the variation we see actually comes from deficiency and error, I feel this explains a lot of the disparities you see coming out of this field. This kind of model can't capture normal variation between groups. It only has the capacity to associate physical and linguistic differences through a lens of pathology. This way of looking at language really conflates linguistic knowledge with linguistic behavior. So what this approach doesn't allow for is the idea that two people could have the same linguistic knowledge, but meaningfully use it in different ways that don't have to do with their physiology. What this approach also doesn't allow for is the idea that two people can demonstrate the same exact language knowledge and still be taken to communicate different things. And as a racialized person, that is especially salient observation to me. So why is it that despite everything we know about social influences on speech, this approach has still maintained such popularity? Well, the answer is reproducibility. We've been in a reproducibility rut. Promoting replicability has gone hand in hand with trying to avoid critically engaging with effects of social variation. If we just control our population and our materials and keep our investigations as narrow as possible to avoid all of this variation, then the idea is that we can extract some universal asocial knowledge about how language works. But again, I find it worth repeating, when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, we aren't talking about new problems. We are talking about very old problems. So why do we still have these same old problems? And the answer is that institutionally speaking, it's just really easy to just keep having the same problems. So as someone who has to code switch, I'm really familiar with the sociolinguistic differences between groups and the spaces that I move through. But those kinds of marginalized realities really go unacknowledged for the large part in linguistic theory. And the reason is that mainstream knowledge production and the validation of mainstream knowledge production really fundamentally depends upon the exploitation and erasure of marginalized people. And I also feel so in speech language hearing sciences, which really focuses on the needs of people with disabilities, that it is especially important for us to really think about how we generalize and the limitations of the populations and the materials that we choose. So I want to convince you that this overemphasis on reproducibility can actually lead us to set ourselves back by rewarding commitments to outmoded methodologies. So the weird acronym was presented to you before. Most of you are probably already familiar with it. And Professor Saya did a great job of explaining some of the criticisms of it. I just want to zero in on sort of how this plays out in speech science, which is that the weird populations that are frequently represented in language studies are white English-speaking people, people who are normatively invisible, so not gender non-conforming or trans, for example, racially colorblind and socially dominant. So I've wedged this into the same acronym, but it's really worth pointing out that even though we can classify this as a group of people that's been frequently studied and looked at, it's not actually a coherent social definition at all. It doesn't really describe a unified group. So what it really describes is participants from particular socioeconomic brackets from these particular countries. And so in this review of the literature on perceiving gender in language that I did with Ben Munson, we reviewed all of this literature, and like the other presenters have described, just overwhelmingly, investigators often neglect to even report the demographics of their participants. So we know from our perspective on weirdness, even accepting that weird isn't a really useful construct per se, that social identity really does matter. And if we choose to believe it doesn't matter, we're not going to get out of actually collecting social information. We're just getting out of admitting what social information we're centering. So choosing to neglect the role of social judgments isn't neutrality. It's just normative bias. So I'm going to present one empirical finding that shows how language is social in ways that speech and language scientists thought that it wasn't. Okay, so if we're stuck in this reproducibility rut, how do we get out of it? And I just want to emphasize what I feel is the most basic first important step, which is just to actually be clear about what it is that you're doing. And so some other speakers have talked about reporting standards. I'm not going to get into the details of that, but I just want to emphasize that over and over again, we see that these problems are reproduced in studies that don't actually mindfully and explicitly characterize which participants they are recruiting, why they're recruiting those particular participants, and contrasting what materials they could choose to use with those participants. And being transparent also includes being clear about who we are and why we're doing the work that we do. So this brings me to how I ended up in Minnesota. I'm originally from Baltimore, Maryland. I did my doctorate in linguistics at the University of Maryland. And as I was graduating, I found out that Ben Munson had gotten NIH funding to create this multiracial database of audiovisual speech stimuli, and then run perception studies looking at how visual information impacted speech intelligibility, both for younger and older adults with hearing loss. So this was really exciting to me because I've been really interested in studying the effects of social perception on speech processing. So I was acutely aware that we really don't have an infrastructure to really facilitate that kind of study. There are databases of audiovisual speech available, but they're not intentionally multiracial. They don't intentionally capture the kind of diversity that we need to really get traction on this question. And this project has as its first specific aim the creation of a resource, a publicly available resource, centering speech diversity as an object of interest. So soon after I joined the Speech Language Hearing Sciences department in the spring of 2020, we had just begun recording in our lab in front of a green screen with a boom mic and a high definition camera, and then COVID hit. So we moved all of our data collection to Zoom. So we recruited our participants with a variety of materials, but one of those is this video that we made. And so those images are clips from our recruitment video, which is on YouTube. And on the right there, that's Molly Babel, who's one of the collaborators. So now I want to rewind, because before we could recruit and record talkers for our database, we had to decide a really important question. If we're going to put together this big database of talkers and they're all going to be saying the same sentences, well, which sentences should we have them say? So I want to zero in here on the social significance of the materials. So I'm going to tell you about our analysis of this set of sentences and the social information reportedly contained in it, and also sort of the story of how we came to do this study. So what we ended up doing was we had our participants record 30 sentences each from 2 standard sets, which are commonly used. And the first is the Harvard/IEEE sentences. So those sentences were developed in the 1950s and 60s, and they were used in assessing audio technology. So they're really instrumental in advancing audio technology. You can think about how much has changed since the 1950s. The other sentence that we used was the BEL, the Bell Basic English Lexicon sentences, and those were designed more recently, and they were designed to be accessible to people who were more relatively new to the English language, so immigrants, for example. And so I'm going to focus on this older set of sentences, the Harvard IEEE sentences, which I'll call the HI sentences. So when I joined the REI project, the Race and Ethnicity Intelligibility project, I said, why are we thinking about using this sentence set? What's the point? And they're really well known. So this is a screen cap of a Gizmodo article. And they've been in use for a really long time. But to me, when I was reviewing these materials, I was like, these sound really strained and outdated and possibly prejudicial. We were doing a study of perception with race and ethnicity. So an HI sentence like, the clan gathered on each dull night, well, that actually reminds me of a very specific clan. So we excluded this sentence from we didn't ask participants to record that sentence. But so I doubt that the author of that sentence, when they put the clan gathered on each dull night into the sentence set, I doubt that they were thinking of the clan that it made me think of. But it's really relevant to mention that these sentences were designed and developed in primarily white institutions. And this conscious knowledge, for me, was part of my experience in reviewing these materials. So I asked Ben, I said, why are you been thinking about using these sentences? And so he explained to me patiently, as many people had previously done, that these sentences were endorsed by the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers as a gold standard in speech intelligibility research. So they've been used a lot, and there are specifically purportedly suited to this task because they were designed to have phonetic balance. And my response to that was just to scoff. Phonetic balance, really. So the claim is that the variation in the speech sounds that appears in each sentence set is actually distributionally similar to the variation of speech sounds that happens in the English language more broadly. But whose English language? So if we think the sentences are phonetically balanced, then I have to ask, phonetically balanced for who? We know that different people have different phonetic distributions. So which people did they actually use to balance this set ostensibly? So the original claim of phonetic balance was actually based on a 100-year-old analysis of written texts. Like, it's now 100 years old, and that means all of the texts that were analyzed are actually older than that, of course. But it's really beside the point, because this claim would still be really unendorsable if it was based on an analysis of modern written texts. There's really no way to support the claim that these sentences demonstrate a balance of spoken sounds. They're written sentences. So I'm thinking, I don't care if these sentences are the gold standard for speech intelligibility research. They sound dusty to me. So I bet other people have similar intuitions. And I bet they will think a significant number of these sentences sound unnatural and racialized. So Ben Munson said, hey, let's find out. So knowing that speech conveys multiple types of information in this single convoluted signal, we felt it was worth asking, given that these sentences were constructed in academia and industry during a time when it was really especially dominated by white men, whether or not people would be able to detect that just in the content of the sentences. So we really focused in on the HI sentences because they've been used so often in speech research. And this claim from 1969 has been cited many, many times to justify the use of these materials. So the question we asked was, what if the sentence materials themselves already suggest social information in their written form before we even have someone say them out loud? And what we wanted to know if the perception of social information was different for sentences that were rated as sounding more natural. Like, what is the effect of naturalness on this perception of social information? So we took 80 sentences, just 80 sentences from the HI set. And then we took 80 comparison sentences from the social discussion board Reddit. And the Reddit sentences were chosen to be sort of a social anchor, because we expected them to have more social information in them. And we intentionally chose them from a variety of subreddits, which included an emphasis on issues of ethnicity, race, and gender. So for example, r/Desi women or r/Black women. So our results will be published in this forthcoming article, but our methods and our data are already publicly available. And shout out to Abby Hamill for her fantastic work on helping us execute this experiment. Okay, so we collected judgments from 124 people, and they all reported English as a first language, and they were in either the US or Canada. So here is the demographic breakdown. So on each trial, we showed them a sentence. This example is, the rope will bind the 7 books at once. Structurally, the HI sentences are made up of all single syllable words plus 1 2-syllable word. So here it's 7 is the double syllable word. So on each trial, the raters were presented with a sentence, and then they were asked a question about its naturalness. They wanted to know, like, how strange did this sentence sound? But it's really hard to get lay people to engage with concepts like naturalness. And so in order to try to make it easy for people to answer this question, we framed it around how surprised you would be to hear this sentence in the past calendar year, the current calendar year. So, right, so here are the data for the perceived naturalness of sentences. So the red bars are the HI sentences and the yellow bars are the Reddit sentences. And as we predicted, people thought that the Reddit sentences, which were penned much more recently, were a lot less surprising to hear in the current calendar year. So we had very significant difference there in the overall ratings of naturalness for the sentences. So this matched our intuitions. So after asking them about the naturalness of the sentence, we then asked them, if you had to guess, would you be fairly certain of the race or ethnicity of the person who produced this sentence? And the reason that we asked them to confirm how confident they were first is we didn't want to collect a bunch of judgments as to race and ethnicity from people who said that they didn't really think that they were confident about those judgments. So if they said they were confident, then they were presented with a list of racial and ethnic categories to choose from. So here, the IEEE sentences are in yellow and the Reddit sentences are in red. And this is how often sentences from that set were reported to contain race and ethnicity information. And it was really just about the same. We did not find a significant difference here. So even though we chose the Reddit sentences to be more explicitly social, they didn't actually elicit that response. And so we had about roughly the same rate for both sets, people saying that they could perceive race information. And what isn't shown here is that raters most frequently reported race, the race that they thought they could perceive, as whiteness. So that was consistent with our prediction for the HI sentences, but not so much for the Reddit sentences. So then we also asked a similarly structured question about gender. If you had to guess, how certain would you be of the gender of the person who produced this sentence? And if they said that they could confidently guess, then we asked them to go ahead and guess from these three options: male, female, and a gender that is neither male nor female. So here, this is actually how often our respondents said, yes, they could perceive gender in the sentences according to their own gender. And what we found is that men were more likely to say that they could guess the gender of a sentence's author. Women were less likely to say that they were confident that they could do that. So again, both sets of sentences were actually rated the same, but we did find this difference in our participants, that the men were more likely to say that they could detect gender. So it was about 1/4 of the responses to both sentence sets that actually got yeses. Yes, I can perceive the gender. So here is a table which sort of shows some representative sentences of what we found. So 2 bluefish swam in the tank was rated as a very natural sentence. It's unsurprising to hear someone say that. Now, the sentence, a tame squirrel makes a nice pet, I found really fascinating. It was rated low for naturalness, but high for race ethnicity information. And 88% of the people who said that they could detect the ethnicity of the person who wrote that sentence said it was written by a white person. I think her purse was full of useless trash is also a very interesting example. It was marked as high in naturalness, but as also high in gendered information, but it was a really even split on whether the gendered information, whether the sentence sounded like it was written by a woman or sounded like it was written by a man. So I found it really interesting how the content of the sentence suggesting gender information really didn't give us a good cue as to which gender. Okay, so this is a really non-trivial portion of the sentences that actually elicited these kinds of attitudes. So item by item, answers to the race and gender questions were associated, which makes sense because we expect race and gender to be socially co-constructed. And actually neither one was associated with judgments of naturalness. So I thought was really interesting that I had expected that more natural sentences would potentially actually convey more social information. But it turns out that from our results, it seems that you don't actually need the sentence to sound natural in order to suggest that, which kind of makes sense. So I feel like there's a lot of interesting details here in the data, and I would like to do, we only tested again 80 sentences from the HI set. So this was important because if we're going to do a study of intelligibility with our participants varying in race and ethnicity, we want to make sure that the materials that we're using aren't going to bias our results. Okay, so When we think about how the development of audio tech has been shaped, when we think about the last 100 years worth of findings on speech intelligibility, I feel like we have to ask ourselves, like, what have we really learned? If 25% of the sentences are actually conveying some sort of bias, then how can we accurately characterize our progress on systems that improve intelligibility? And the pressure to just use the same materials over again because they've already ostensibly been validated and verified and are ostensibly generalizable, it is a really strong pressure that nobody was going to ask us, if we use these sentences and only these sentences, why would you use such gold standard sentences? Nobody would ask that. If we didn't use them though, then of course they would, why did you choose this over the set of sentences which has been so often endorsed? So that navigation of expectations plays a lot more into the way we construct our methodologies, I think, than a lot of us want to admit. So in the short term, we could extend this norming exercise to the entire set of HI sentences and then only endorse using those sentences which we find don't convey this gender and race information, those which appear to be more neutral to us, like it rained, snowed, and hailed in the same morning. Another thing that we can do is to try to be more transparent about the criteria that we use to exclude sentences. So we chose to exclude this sentence about the Klan, but there isn't really a public set of guidelines which we could use to justify which sentences we chose to leave out as potentially prejudicial without actually just running these kinds of rating studies all the time. And that's the other real key point that I want to make, is that as we move forward, like, we could clean up the HI sentences and put together a sentence set based off of these materials that actually sounds like they were written this century. We could do that, but they're going to go out of, they're going to obsolesce too. They're going to go out of style just like everything else does. So I think we can do better than just trying to keep up. I think that we need to be more ambitious. I think that we need to treat this constantly evolving perception of social variability as something that we need to be agile and flexible and proactive about. Instead of designing a set of sentences that doesn't seem biased today and then waiting for it to eventually show its age, I think that we need to develop measures of social and psycholinguistic orientation so that we can characterize our participants' responses to these materials, so that we can tell when they're going out of date and for who, basically. Because we can't assume that the social expectations of all of our participants are going to be the same. And so endlessly trying to strip all of the social information out of the data doesn't actually get us anywhere closer to understanding where this variability comes from or how it functions. So to sum up, the traditional approach to identifying replicable effects in sociolinguistics has been to define language as this asocial phenomenon and abstract out the role of social characteristics. And this doesn't really work for three reasons. The first is that it expects exclusion by defining social variability as lacking salience, and then by extension, the scholars who are interested in social variability are also essentially deemed less salient to their fields. It functions to actually invisibilize the social characteristics of study participants. Just because we claim that we're trying to study an asocial phenomenon doesn't mean that we actually have extracted that study from a social milieu. And finally, it just ends up producing science which cannot explain or describe the social variability that we know exists. just leaving data on the table. So first steps away from this, we need to really try to transparently characterize the social milieu that our psycholinguistic experiments are taking place in. That instead of assuming that our participants' attitudes towards the materials can be assumed like generalizable, that we actually need to validate that when we administer these kinds of tests. We need to anticipate the potential for different groups to perceive these things differently. And the benefits of this approach is that, first of all, it actually endeavors to effectively describe the social variation. Instead of just trying to pretend it doesn't exist, it actually engage with these phenomena. Then the second is that it really makes transparent our judgments as investigators about which social characteristics we think are relevant and which ones we think are not relevant. And finally, it affects inclusion by defining the social variability as salient and therefore validating scholars who actually want to focus on these kinds of issues, which I think has really been our greatest failing. So to sum up, reproducibility provides support that our existing observations are useful in explaining the observable world. And that emphasizes the part of the story that's already been told. And institutionally, we have been telling the same stories for a really long time, and it's time to really mix it up. And I really think that this transition is easier than we make it out to be. So diversity, equity, and inclusion really demands that we innovate. But it, of course, also provides support for reproducibility. It just demands that we really think carefully about which methodologies, which materials, which populations we want to look at. And crucially, that all emphasizes the part of the story that's been suppressed, ignored, denied, and erased. And that is my talk.
So I'll start the questions because one came to mind towards the end there. I take it in your area, one of the things that investigators are trying to do is find ways to help people in the process of developing speech, language, and hearing patterns. How do we think about the distinction between normal and abnormal when it is put alongside of the importance of variability that you emphasized today? I'm curious about that because I imagine that in the past, abnormal was departure from the speech that was taken to be the standard that ignored the variability. And now that we've brought the variability back in, or we're trying to bring the variability back in, how do we think about that distinction between normal and abnormal?
I think that speech language hearing sciences is really having a crisis of conscience right now. And that there are a lot of people really trying to grapple with this and how do we move forward, since again, clinically, the focus of speech language hearing sciences is to actually assist people with differences. So if you have normal speech and hearing, then you don't actually have any need for the services of a speech language pathologist. So the question of like what counts as normal has been how we've guided our thinking about who needs these services. And I think what we really need to be doing is to place more emphasis on qualitative analysis and outcomes instead of saying, okay, well, these people have poor hearing and so therefore automatically are going to need some kind of intervention. And we actually need to ask them, how is your community? Could you use help? Because the actual assistance that different people want, someone with the same level of disability might be more interested in getting a cochlear implant, and someone else might be more interested in learning to communicate effectively in ASL. Trying to define abnormal versus normal, I think, is too prescriptive, and it tries to fit everyone into the same treatment model. If we can decide exactly what your abnormality is, we know exactly what we need to do to fix it. But instead of trying to fix our patients and our clients, what we really need to do is to help them to have better access. So, and that really requires an intimate conversation with individuals about what they need. So I really think that the abnormal normal distinction places a really heavy emphasis on the view from nowhere. That it doesn't actually matter what this individual or what the variability is among people with that disability, that isn't as important as what we from on high decide counts as typical, counts as irregular, counts as in need of intervention.
Great, thank you very much.
Great talk. Whoa, that's loud. Sorry. Great talk. Thank you very much. Appreciate that. So I fully agree with you, your argument that trying to come up with sentences or stimuli that are sort of neutral, right, is futile and probably misguided. And the idea behind it is that if we create some kind of neutral stimuli that's inclusive of everyone who interacts with it, then our outcomes will be more valid and generalizable. And I think that also is, I think your argument that's probably not the case. So it kind of shifts attention from the stimuli side more to the outcome side. So thinking more about how to build the bias into, I'm saying outcomes broadly, but like whatever it is we're actually trying to assess. And so rather than pretending like there is no bias, we put it into more of the measurement or the analysis of the outcome or the interpretation. I don't know. I wonder if you could just, you said a little bit about that, but I wonder, does that make sense the way I'm framing it? And if so, could you expand a little bit on how you think we might be able to do that?
So I described sort of the traditional approach to trying to treat language like just, like a physical phenomenon. And so what I'm really interested in pushing for is defining language centrally as a more psychologically founded phenomenon. So the idea that, again, two people could have the same linguistic knowledge, but exhibit different behavior because they have different motivations. And there is some relatively recent work where people are trying, especially speech language hearing sciences, to expand this notion, but it's amazingly late to me for like 2016 to be publishing a model. And like, I'm thankful that they did, but I cannot remember the authors off the top of my head, but a model of effortful listening. And this idea that it actually takes cognitive effort to focus on what someone's saying to you, and that could be different for different people and different impairments. And again, this is something that anyone who actually has hearing difficulties knows. So why is speech language hearing sciences so late to actually incorporate this? So really, rather than trying to come up with stimuli that we can expect to be generalizably neutral, I want to come up with methods which actually try to capture the social orientation, like the psycholinguistic orientation of our participants. So this slide is a little bit messed up from translating to PowerPoint, but I have this acronym. The P is cut off. P is for place. So MUDCAC. And I developed this with Ben Munson when we were doing this review of the gender literature. We find so many different effects that it's like, how can you actually try to sum up like, where is gender happening? And I think the first thing that we really need to grapple with is that we expect people to come into these experiments where we ask them, did you hear a man or a woman? With a notion of what man and woman mean. And if you subscribe to the common mainstream ideologies regarding the definitions, it's like Someone who is a man definitely cannot simultaneously be a woman. It might sound like common sense to most people, but if we're simply assuming that people think those things and not actually measuring them, then it hampers our ability to actually characterize what is happening when people are gendered. So we really need to grapple with when we have people come into the lab. So in this study where we plan to do these perception experiments and we're going to show people of different races and ethnicities, we did a separate norming study to try to get data from other people so that instead of relying on self-report, we actually could get a separate measure on how the people we recorded are typically racialized. So that we could get more depth on that measure as far as, and it matters if you're asking people to pick racial categories, whether they think those racial categories are real or significant. And that's going to vary between people. So what we've done is a very rudimentary first step is to require the most basic reporting. Like the NIH funded our study, and so they require that we ask everyone to check off some of like the 5 boxes for race and ethnicity. But we know that those boxes don't really translate into solid predictions. So again, like taking that split of like, here's 5 different race ethnicity categories and people could check them off. Like, not everyone who participates is going to give equal weight to different combinations of check marks, for example. And so instead of trying to nail down one definition of what race or ethnicity or gender means, what we really need to do is pull back and describe how participants go about making those judgments. And so when we think about gender, what often goes unmentioned is that we have these really strong, unsupportable opinions about how these categories interact. Underdetermination, so like if you think of male as a gendered category, it's underspecified with respect to age. You can have baby males and you can have adult males. And where's the line between them? It's not really actually, there's no one standard way of determining that. In the studies on gender that we looked at, they often would do things like ask participants to rate the attractiveness of the stimuli, and then they would specifically use the stimuli which were judged to be most attractive to then elicit judgments of gender. So that's embedding this ideology about what kinds of gender presentations actually count as most desirable, without actually explicating in the methods, like here's why we thought attractiveness would be an important thing to look at. So then the last 3 are conventionality, agency, and place. And so that's my sort of my blueprint, my roadmap for how to move forward in trying to characterize the ideology of participants with respect to these social categories.
Join with me in thanking Alayo for her talk.